Thank you. Highly esteemed Professor Snyder, distinguished panel, colleagues, friends. I am happy to welcome you at the premises of Lithuania's Jewish History Museum and Tolerance Center for the current discussion. From the very beginning of independence, in reborn Lithuania, historians and educators, teachers and intellectuals strived to inform themselves and the young about the complicated history of this country. However, to take a dispassionate look needed for research while having victims of both regimes in almost every family in Lithuania requires significant effort on the part of everybody involved. And this is not only the history of victimhood, but the history of collaboration too, and sometimes resistance. At the same time, more often than not, the moral dilemmas were diluted in the gray area of just passers-by or observers of brutal and horrible events. To define what it was, this was genocide, and this was straticide, and sometimes this was everything at once. Definitions apply, but sometimes they are too narrow. We could see here that certain individuals were victims under one regime and the perpetrators under another. In the memoirs of Holocaust survivors, one can find a trace of post-war repressions too, as in the case of my mother from Kaunas, who, surviving Stutthof and the death march, found herself being interrogated in the Soviet zone about what favors did she really trade with the Nazis and how could she explain she was able to stay alive in the concentration camp. Even here, in the Jewish Museum, we find it hard to focus on the uniqueness of Holocaust exclusively, as we need to answer the questions of our contemporaries about the year of 1940 and the existence under 4 decades of post-war regime in Lithuania. One cannot but come to the conclusion that by putting a lid of censorship, which is a well-known fact, on the public discussions and education about the Holocaust, the Soviets abetted the Nazi crimes, not to mention the murderous Stalinist anti-Semitic campaigns. This, in our view, is one of the reasons why the populations of the former Western Soviet republics were caught unaware of the traps their history had in store for them when freedom finally was won. Allow me to inform you that this museum is planning a big exhibition for the next year, The Jews of Lithuania under the Soviet Rule. In my understanding, Professor Snyder, Bloodlands was received here as a landmark work. Thank you for your contribution to the widening discourse on the recent history, which I hope may help to integrate our past into the general history of the European continent. And let me thank the US Embassy for generous support in dealing with these issues and for this opportunity to conduct a discussion on these issues online. And now for the discussion, which is moderated by Dr. Saulius Suziedelis, who worked as a researcher for the International Commission of Investigation of Nazi and Soviet Crimes in Lithuania. Saulius, the podium is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. Good afternoon, or good morning or evening, depending on where you may be. I'm very pleased to welcome this distinguished panel, and also members of the audience, particular Ambassador Dersi. I'm glad you can be here. I'm glad to report that we have 2 very distinguished guests from the United States, and I would like to introduce them now. Sitting on my left is Professor Jonathan Brent. Dr. Brent is currently the Executive Director of YIVO Institute for Jewish Research and served for many years as Editorial Director of Yale University Press. He is the director of the well-known and highly regarded Annals of Communism series, also author of the book Inside the Stalin Archives, which I, by the way, enjoyed very much. And he has also worked as visiting professor at Bard College. Further on the left, we have our guest of honor, Dr. Timothy Snyder, who is the Hosen Professor of History at Yale University. He has published numerous studies of Central and Eastern Europe, has written widely in the US Polish press. His 2 books that are most relevant for us, considering our regional focus, is The Reconstruction of Nations, published in 2003, as well as, of course, the book that is the focus of discussion today, Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, published in 2010. Dr. Snyder is currently touring Europe, and I understand this is his final stop. Also, I would suggest that you might want to look at a new book that has come out in which Dr. Snyder wrote down much of what Tony Judt, the famous intellectual, and it's entitled Thinking the 20th Century, a very worthwhile production. Further on my left is Dr. Sarunas Liekis. He is Dean and Professor of the Faculty of Diplomacy and Political Science at Vytautas Magnus University. He has studied and worked in Brandeis University, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Oxford. He travels to Israel frequently and lectures there, has done research at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He's the author of 2 important studies of 20th century Lithuania. One on author, it's called A State Within a State, Jewish Autonomy, published in 2003. And recently, a book entitled 1939, The Year That Changed Everything. On the far left, and I don't mean politically necessarily, but we have Professor Egidijus Aleksandravicius, former Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at Vytautas Magnus University. He is a very prominent historian of the 19th century, has taught in Helsinki, the University of Illinois, and is director now of the Emigre Study Center at Vytautas Magnus. He has written widely in the Lithuanian press. He is known for his commentary on current political and cultural issues, and is one of the most widely read and respected public intellectuals in this country. I am Saulius Suziedelis, Professor Emeritus, Millersville University, and formerly a visiting professor at Vytautas Magnus University as well. I would like to mention also that this evening at 5 o'clock, Professor Snyder will lecture at Vilnius University. It is an event sponsored by the Polish Institute, the History Faculty of Vilnius University, as well as the U.S. Embassy. That will be at 5 o'clock. I would like to propose here, this is more of, I would think, a rather informal discussion among the panel here, but with the focus on the ideas and conceptions that Dr. Snyder has presented in his seminal work, Bloodlands. The format of this discussion is going to be that we will discuss some questions relating to the theoretical and practical issues which result from Dr. Snyder's book, Bloodlands. And also, I have a few questions to begin the discussion, just to begin the discussion, also to Dr. Brent, as well as to Sarunas and Egidijus. After that, we will continue our discussion. When the time for our formal presentations, or informal presentations, sorry, is over, we will be able to take some questions from the internet, after which we will conclude our program. I would like to begin with 2 questions to Professor Snyder. And they are these. First, it seems to me that we all agree that it's a rather novel idea to integrate the history of this 1933 to 1945 period in the particular way that you did, with its very interesting regional focus. And I would like to ask what led you to this concept and to this methodology, how you came to it. Secondly, I would like for you to address the issue of the criticism by some that your book and the way it is structured somehow leads to quote-unquote moral equivalence. In a 1970 issue of Slavic Review, the well-known historian Omer Bartov commented that your work, quote-unquote, drains the war of moral content. So I want to ask how you square this with what can be a legitimate place for comparative history, which has a long and respectable tradition, and how we can discuss Stalinism and Nazism while at the same time acknowledging the unique nature of the Holocaust and not to go into a place where we would be trivializing the genocide of the Jews. Could you address that for us, please?
Sure. So I'll be very conventional, and I will address the two questions in the order that they were asked. But first, I'd like to thank the organizers for the wonderful welcome and all of you for coming to this place. I conceived the book the way that I did precisely because of experience in Eastern Europe. I conceived the book the way that I did because I came to see, as I became a historian of this place, that many of the things that we in the West regarded as very important have their geography actually here. So, as any normal American of my generation was, I was raised in the Cold War. I was perfectly aware in a general way of Soviet terror. I was taught about the Holocaust in high school, and even if I hadn't been, I would have been aware of the Holocaust in a general way. These were big, important concepts in any normal Western education. As I had the good fortune of coming to Eastern Europe and learning East European languages and spending much of my adult life here, I came to understand that these events have a geography, and that geography is precisely here. Now, what does that mean for someone who becomes an East European historian? If you become an East European historian, you're generally then thinking in terms of nations. You might be critical of the nation, you might try to deconstruct the origins of the nation, but most East European historians did and still do right within the framework of the nation. But there is some events, like Soviet terror, but above all, the Holocaust, which can't fit into a national framework, which national frameworks tend to minimize. If you try to push it into a national framework, it slides beyond it because it's so much bigger than anything which happens just in Lithuania, just in Poland, just in the Soviet Union. It's an event which goes beyond any national framework. So what I thought as I became an East European historian, as I was writing other books about Eastern Europe, was that East European historiography, East European historians have a certain responsibility to these events, that we in some way have not mastered, have not treated these events with the seriousness that they deserve, that we have to find a way to get beyond just the nation or criticizing the nation and write about the Holocaust, that we should write about the Holocaust above all. Not just historians of Jewish life, although of course they should, and not just historians of Germany, although of course they should, but that we East European historians have a kind of moral duty to take up this subject. And then of course, as I became an East European historian, I realized something else, and that was that people in the West think they understand the Holocaust. They think they understand Soviet terror. But because they, like me, when I was learning, lack the geography, the understanding is incomplete. And this leads and has led, and I'm afraid still will lead, to many misunderstandings between Western and East Europeans. Understandings which concern not only Soviet terror, but misunderstandings which also concern the Holocaust. The way the Holocaust is seen in the West, I'm afraid to say, is also very partial, very minimal, focusing on the experiences of West European Jews, focusing on Auschwitz, which is very important, but it's only the beginning of the story. It's not really the end. So from the point of view of someone who is becoming an East European historian and a European historian, I thought there was a kind of duty to try to do better, to try to bring in the events we all regard as important, to set them in their proper historical background, so that we can not only describe them and explain them, but so that we can have a larger discussion to which all of us, with our various backgrounds, our various experiences, can have some sort of entry. Now, this all led me to territory, because as a historian of this region, it slowly dawned on me that this was not just a region where certain kinds of catastrophes happened. It was the region where most of them happened. The region that I describe as the Bloodlands, which is Ukraine, Belarus, Western Russia, the Baltics, most of Poland, this is the region where the Holocaust not only started, this is the region where the Holocaust happened. And the place where the Holocaust happened is also where the Germans starved 3 million Soviet prisoners of war to death. The place where the Holocaust happened is also where the Germans shot nearly 1 million non-Jewish civilians in reprisal actions. And the place where the Holocaust happened is also where the bulk of Soviet terror took place. So if we look at a certain place, a relatively small place, we see the deliberate mass murder of 14 million human beings. That in itself would seem to be a question worth answering. That is, why did the Holocaust happen, and why did it happen in a place where so many other catastrophes, so many other policies of deliberate murder happened? And given that almost all of the killing of the two regimes happened here, don't we need to understand the territory in order to understand the two regimes? If this is where they killed, then we need to look here. So the fundamental perspective is that whether we're trying to understand the events or the regimes or, above all, the victims, because this is where the victims lived, almost all of them, not only died but lived, if we want to understand them and take them seriously, we have to focus on this place. And what place allows one to do is to look at not one regime but both. It allows one to look not just at one victim group but at all of them. And above all, it allows us to see something which I think is quite fundamental, which is that even if all you want to do is understand your own group, you have no choice but to understand the history of others, even if you don't care at all personally about those other people, even if all you want to do is understand Lithuanian history, even if all you want to do is understand Polish history, even if all you want to do is understand the Holocaust, you have no choice but to try to understand the other events around it. So that's what I've tried to do. I've tried to bring this together as a history which allows us to explain the series of catastrophes, acknowledging that each of them was different. Each of them was in important ways, and I'm about to talk about that, but also permitting us different ways from our own different perspectives of coming in and understanding this catastrophe. So the second question was this moral equivalence business. Anyone who claims that my book stands for the moral equivalence of these two regimes either hasn't read it, in which case they're just irresponsible. You shouldn't say things about books you haven't read, or they have read it and they're animated by bad faith. There is no way that you can read this book as claiming that the two regimes were morally equivalent. Nothing remotely like that is in the book. On the contrary, the book makes an argument which takes us away, creates a pause for breath before we compare. As those of you who live in Eastern Europe know, the impulse to compare is always immediate. There are two very quick impulses. The first is compare right away, and the second is let's ban all comparisons right away, right? Those are the two very quick impulses. Neither of those impulses is helpful, I think. If we want to understand what's actually happened in the time and place, we have to do something besides compare. Why is that? Because when we compare, we're assuming we know everything we need to know about the two sides. If I want to compare me and let's say the gentleman in the first row, I have to know everything about the gentleman in the first row, which I don't. So what my study does is that it puts all the comparisons off. It sets the comparative questions off until the very end, and instead it examines the two regimes in the place where they were most lethal, where the Germans performed almost all of their killing and the Soviets a great deal of theirs. What this then becomes is a study of interaction. It's a study of interaction of peoples, of states, and of regimes. It's a study which demonstrates where the two regimes influenced each other, which sometimes they did, and where they didn't, right? So an obvious example was already alluded to. It's very difficult to imagine Stalinist anti-Semitism without the contact with Nazi Germany, without the Second World War, right? That's an example of a kind of interaction. Now, where does this leave me on the issue of comparison? And here I'm going to be very categorical. Although my book is not set up as a comparison, I believe we have to pause and think and learn before we compare. I'm against this impulse to immediately compare. At the same time, I'm treating this side of the room as the people who are in favor of this. I'm also against the idea of banning comparison, of putting a taboo on comparison. If we pretend that there's a taboo on comparison, we can't think at all. It's impossible to think. If you want to say, for example, the Holocaust was the worst crime committed on these territories, you've just made a comparison, right? So if you want to ban yourself from making comparisons, then you can't say that the Holocaust was the worst crime committed on these territories, right? So if we seriously enforce some kind of taboo on comparisons, there'd be nothing that we could say which was of any value. And it becomes all the more absurd when you read the sources, as I spent a great deal of time doing. Because people on these territories experienced both Soviet and German power, naturally they compared. Anybody who spent any time with Jewish testimony material knows this is true. Jews and everyone else were comparing all the time, and there are literally tens of thousands of traces of this in the historical record. It would be very strange if they didn't, right? Because the differences between the regimes were the things they had to understand if they wanted to try to survive. So, of course, the people in the time and place, Jewish, Lithuanian, or whatever they might be, compared all the time. They didn't, of course, say the two regimes were the same, because that would be an absurd conclusion, which only an absurd person would draw, right? Almost no one thinks the two regimes are the same. So I think we know that this notion of banning comparison makes no sense, right? If I were to say, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are incomparable, what am I really saying? I'm saying, I have already compared them, you may not compare them, and I have the microphone. That's all it means. It's a power claim. The taboo on comparison is a power claim. It doesn't make any logical sense. Anyone who says two things are incomparable has already compared them himself. The word incomparable means I've already compared them and you can't. So, whereas I think we have to know what we're talking about before we make comparisons, and I resist the urge to compare right away, I also think the move to ban all comparisons would make it literally impossible to think. And it would make it impossible for us to say things like, the Holocaust was the worst crime committed on these territories. That is, after all, a comparative judgment. So where the book comes down on these issues with respect to the Holocaust is in an interesting place. The book shows that the Holocaust was not only an unprecedented crime in the way that we generally think, that is, it was the only attempt to physically exterminate an entire people. It also shows that the Holocaust was an unprecedented crime in another way, that is, it killed more human beings than any Soviet policy or any other German policy. In other words, it was qualitatively and quantitatively unprecedented. I can make this argument comfortably without any sort of hesitation or defensiveness because all of the other policies of mass killing are in the book. In other words, if you want to make a comparison, you have to have the things you're comparing with in your study, which is why my defense of the unprecedented character of the Holocaust is actually the most radical ever published. No Holocaust historian before me has made the claim both in qualitative and quantitative terms. But what's a little different about my book is that that wasn't the point. The comparisons are in the conclusions. If you take the trouble to read the book all the way to the end, you can read what I've just said at the end of the book. But it's not the point of the book. The point of the book is to try to explain how a catastrophe could have happened in which 14 million human beings were murdered. That was my subject.
Thank you very much, Dr. Snyder. I'd like to turn now to Professor Brent of YIVO, and really not so much two questions, but two foci of discussion. One is I would ask you to comment on what we just heard, but then as representative of YIVO, and I don't think any of us here need to learn much. We all know what YIVO was. To me, it was the crown jewel of Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. In many ways, it included very, very prominent members. As director of YIVO, what is your opinion of how do the Litvaks, the Jews and so on, the people who have roots in this land, how they view historic Lithuania and how do they view current Lithuania? But I would also offer you an opportunity to comment on what Professor Snyder said.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this conference, which I think is extremely important. First, I'd like to comment that there have been many attempts, 4 or 5 that I can think of, attempts at comparing Stalin with Hitler. Robert Tucker, in his biography of Stalin, comes very close. In fact, he's explicit in stating that under Stalin, the Soviet system was becoming a form of Bolshevik nationalism. There's a book, Hitler, Stalin, during World War II. Gelatelli writes a book on Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler. There have been attempts, but there has been no attempt in any way as profound, I think, as Bloodlands, which is so detailed in bringing together the actual, trying to integrate intellectually the question of how the regimes functioned in the killing fields of Eastern Europe. That is unprecedented about this book. It is a book, however you wish to disagree with minor conclusions or major conclusions, it opens the way. It is a breakthrough book in that regard, that it opens the way for further discussion that is meaningful historically. And I would like to come back to something that Omer Bartov was quoted as saying, that such work as Professor Snyder's empties the Holocaust of its moral meaning.
He said the war of moral content. Empty the war of moral content.
The war.
Mm-hmm. Eastern Front.
Oh, I see. He wasn't commenting on the book.
He was reviewing the book.
He was reviewing the book. I would say that in my opinion, the subject of the Holocaust and the subject of the Stalinist regimes have to be studied both in two different ways. One way is to understand them philosophically and morally, and I think by morally, generally what is implied is from the standpoint of condemnation for their crimes. But we can't really understand their crimes unless we understand how they functioned, unless we understand the mentality and the mechanism whereby these regimes did what they did. And unfortunately, the Cold War in America and the post-Holocaust world, to a great extent in America, but I think elsewhere, created paradigms for understanding these two regimes that have been very harmful to the actual understanding of how this happened. At the end of Raoul Hilberg's monumental destruction of the European Jews, he concludes in the new edition of the book, the phrase "never again" is empty. Not only will it happen again, it has already happened again. And Professor Hilberg, whom no one could accuse of being a Holocaust denier, is very pointed in stating that the basic moral question of the Holocaust has been repeated in Rwanda, in Bosnia, and elsewhere. Of course, he's been criticized for this. He was criticized for this by those who wish to see these issues simply in the black and white terms of moral evil and moral good. And I think one of, again, the great contributions of Tim Snyder's book is precisely that he opens up the historical mechanism whereby these moral judgments can be made. But again, if we don't understand how these things happened, the slow accretion of detail, for instance, the most interesting problematic of the Holocaust is that initially there was no decision to annihilate all of the Jews of Europe. It was a decision they came to. Not that they didn't hate the Jews, not that they weren't anti-Semitic, but the decision to kill all of them was not there. Just as in many of the Soviet crimes that were committed, the decision to murder was not there in the beginning, but the system, because of the way it operated, yielded this product at the end. One can find this even in one of the most heinous Soviet crimes of Katyn. If you read the documentation, you realize that the Soviets went through a long process of interviewing and trying to re-educate the Polish officers. When they were unsuccessful, the option was only one: kill them. So the question is not whether killing them was evil. The question is, why was that their only option? Why did they think that way? And to understand how they think that way requires that we understand precisely this history that Bloodlands opens up for us. I think in America, and I speak now to the second question of being the head of the YIVO Institute now, I can say that first of all, there is no unanimity among Litvaks that I know of. On our board of trustees, there are children of survivors from Vilna. Some are very in favor of opening new initiatives here in Lithuania. Some are not. Some hold fast to the historical memory of good and evil. And when you hold fast to these moral judgments of good and evil, you're left only with those moral judgments. And you know nothing about the concrete world that underlies them. And there are others who certainly wish to see YIVO move forward with the initiatives that we have begun to undertake with the Lithuanian government. I think that this diversity is healthy, and in an odd way, I see the task as being not necessarily to overturn the moral judgments, but to overcome them. To understand that these moral judgments are true, but they're not the only truth. That truth is a difficult thing, that it is not easily graspable by the handle of good and evil, nor by the metric of how many people were killed and whether this was more in one group or more in another group. But we have to understand this enormous mechanism of the history of the 20th century that produced the greatest tragedy worldwide, that certainly existed in Europe in our lifetimes. And that's what the YIVO Institute is dedicated to doing now. And for that reason, the work like Professor Snyder's is work that we encourage, and we hope to stimulate more of that through the programs that we hope to develop here in Lithuania.
Thank you, Dr. Brent. I would like to next turn to a more specific and local focus and involve my dear friends and colleagues from many years, Sarunas Liekis, Egidijus, Aleksandravicius, and turn to Lithuania itself. I'm doing that because it struck me that the Bloodlands, of course, is a relatively large region that is quite diverse. And in fact, that's not the only story. I just read a book called Reichskommissariat Ostland. It was a collection of 17 articles, one of which was about Estonia. An Estonian memory about the Holocaust, according to this author, Olaf Metelsmann, suffers from the fact that for Estonians it is demonstrably provable that the Soviet period was worse, both statistically and in terms of the manifest suffering, for ethnic Estonians, I emphasize. About 8,000 inhabitants of Estonia were killed during the German occupation, and I think this places Estonia just above Denmark in those countries which statistically suffered death the least. So it's not surprising that they would remove the bronze soldier, at least in my view. One can have different opinions on this. Now, however, this is not true of Lithuania. In this same Reichskommissariat Ostland, which includes Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and also Western Belarus, of course, the scale of Nazi destruction was immense. And it was here that the quantum leap from persecution to mass murder and then to genocide was initiated in the summer of 1941. The Holocaust began here. Now, the Lithuanian people did not choose this course of events. It was brought on them. I can say that, of course, while not denying the participation of many, and too many, local people in the destruction. So I want to ask my two Lithuanian colleagues, why is it so difficult in this country to make the Holocaust a central event in historic consciousness and memory as part of maybe the single most important event of the 20th century in our history? Secondly, if you could tell us, has there been progress in this regard of opening up hearts and minds to the problems of that? And do you think, finally, and I won't torture you with any more questions after this, can Bloodlands contribute to a broader understanding among the public in this country to the aim of broadening our historical perspective? I would ask Egidijus to speak first.
Even if we already decided with Sarunas that he will start, and I will explain right now why. Because I feel a bit strange here at the table, because I'm not a researcher of the Second World War and those mass crimes and all that stuff. I'm the researcher of historiography, or some means of memory, and how Lithuanian historiography, Lithuanian storytelling affects now Lithuanian memories. And that's why I read Timothy Snyder's book with so great interest that even being a bit far from the topic, I decided to write a review for Lietuvos istorijos metraštis once. And maybe I will return back to this and explain what can be extremely useful from that book, or from that experiences for Lithuanian education or memories, or the way understanding ourselves. But the first question was about this comparative point, I mean Estonian and Lithuanian experiences, Estonian victims and Lithuanian victims. Why the Holocaust is not the center of Lithuanian contemporary identity, for example. Why? And I suppose that many of different variations or interpretations were already published. My point here would be that Lithuanians somehow, in the majority of cases, avoid to recognize the Jews, the Litvaks, as our own body, own nation, own people. The strange, the stranger. That's how could Lithuanian martyrology, those experiences they remember so well about Soviet occupation, all terrors, all that stuff, covers the other case. They are strangers, and Lithuanians could escape from being somehow together. And the next point is extremely psychological, that if you not avoid to be together with those victims of Holocaust, then the case of guilt, somewhere deep in the collective consciousness or subconsciousness, feeling of guilt, which is so terribly big, so difficult to live with that. And it pushes or it makes some obstacles to allow those views, those pictures, those sorts of memory to be deep in the Lithuanian identity or consciousness or something like that. It's my explanation. I don't know the ways how to change that. I remember only the discussion, maybe you, Saulius, remember also last year or maybe the year before the last, the discussions also organized by American Embassy on the case of Holocaust education. My point was that I remember tens of very massive and sometimes even expensive actions how to develop Holocaust education cases in Lithuania. And the effect, the feedback, nobody counted, but the feedback was not so big. We can tell all the stories. We can say that after this International Commission of the Nazi and Soviet crimes, after all those publications, almost everything is proved and known for the academical people here in Lithuania. But the mass consciousness was not affected so deeply. And it means that the ways of storytelling still are extremely important. How to tell that story, which is really researched, if we speak about Lithuanian participation, but how to tell that. And here I would return back to Timothy's book and some open gates for that. My explanation here would be, I remember maybe in the year 2000, the World Committee of Historical Discipline or Science in Oslo. And the general topic for that meeting, that Congress, was what we called history sublime. The challenge for the history science at all. Would this discipline be able to tell about what we used to say, it happened. It was so terrible that we will not forget, but it was so terrible that we will not be able to tell. Because just to expose those millions, those numbers, those corpses, those all terrible views, sometimes pushes the contemporary memories of consciousness just to close. Like, remember one discussion at Yarton Manor House in Oxford with Jorn Rosen, and it was his claim saying that if we would tell 16-year-old guys straight the story, we will make a crime. It's a real challenge for the history discipline, for the craft and science. And in this respect, I really could say I was skeptical about history, about the science, about the discipline. Skeptical because even if we write books, nothing changed. Even if we know the facts, the numbers, the pictures, all that, somehow it is isolated from our living opinion or something like that. And reading Bloodlands, somehow I returned back to some hopeful statements. So it returned some hope that it is possible to tell. And then even Lithuanian readers, the most sensitive people who would escape from those pictures from the past, they could open the gates back to memory, start with the understanding how it could happen, how the individual could be involved in that, how those inhuman systems could make all that mechanical. And this is, in my understanding, a real challenge, and the hope that it will influence our storytelling abilities and the abilities to understand, to allow, be together with those events somehow. And this is my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Egidijus. Saruna, last but not least.
I'll try to be short.
No, we have some time.
I have some time, and actually not repeating on what Egidijus said. I would like to start from
microphone.
Okay. I would like to start from the point that Very often we forget in what kind of environment and social environment we all live, and very often we forget how do we define ourselves. And the way Lithuanians define themselves in our days is a little bit problematic from the point of many narratives and from the point of even history interpretations. The ethno-nationalist definition of itself creates all kinds of problems when the nation, quote unquote, reflects on its own history, its past, and its own deeds. And Saulius mentioned the example of Estonia, and I think we have equivalent situation here in Lithuania, actually, because the majority population still don't think, and though there are good tendencies that they start to think in the right way, the majority of the population don't think that the Jews are one of their own. And I like this phrase of moral duties. I think it's not the question only of how you define contemporary Lithuanian, how you define that the contemporary Lithuanian is defined purely in ethnic terms, but it's also a moral duty. And the very fact that many people fail to appreciate it and to do their best on these moral duties finally to their co-citizens is very troublesome phenomena generally in self-reflection of the majority of the contemporary Lithuanians. And this is related to the third problem which was mentioned, and not the problem, the issue which was mentioned by Saulius about how do we see, Timothy's book in this context. I think in this context the book is very helpful because it brings to much larger context and brings, let's say, Lithuanian, Jewish, Ukrainian suffering into much larger context and steps over the traditional nationalist narrative or national history narrative, because very often this national history narrative is nationalist narrative most often. And he goes beyond. And Timothy's book goes beyond this nationalist narrative, and naturally then, it calls in all kinds of reactions. Very often, sometimes these reactions can be negative because people who used to look from this very empirical traditional history writing, for them, this deep specialization very often, lacks kind of larger philosophical approach to life, to contemporary politics, finally. And this is one of the problems of not only of the society, how do they look at the past, but it's a problem also of how historians perceive the craft. And I think these innovative approaches to writing history are very welcomed, and I think many people in Lithuania and elsewhere should learn from Timothy.
We still have some time left. I would like to raise a question that has been in my mind for some time. And we've been talking about memory, as Egidijus pointed out, some sort of historical consciousness. It does appear to me that, particularly in this country, we have parallel memories that don't intersect. We have the memories of the Soviet partisan movement, and we have the memories of my uncle. I'll explain. In my family cemetery, which is located near the Belarus border, there are gravestones for two families which were murdered on 8th of May 1945, the end of the war, you see. One was a gravestone in Polish, the other one is in Lithuanian, and they were victims of the opposing forces in the post-war struggle. And my uncle once said, young man, he said, when I first visited him, it was after the war when all hell broke loose. And as you may know, in the Lithuanian language, the word pokaris, the after-war, denotes violence, not peace. Because for ethnic Lithuanians, the years after 45 were demonstrably statistically more deadly than the years from 41 to 44. So you have two memories of events, two experiences. And people do focus on these experiences of themselves, less on, of course, the suffering of others. And so the post-war Lithuanian experience, in the sense that I've described, seems to be foreign sometimes to Jews. The Jewish suffering experience seems foreign to Lithuanians, and therefore the memories of the war differ. They are also compounded by problems in language. For many Lithuanians, including I think my family here, the word anti-fascist carries no positive meaning, for a very simple reason that in their experience of life, Stalinists were anti-fascists, and that can't possibly be a good thing. And so what we do, we have a process in which people can't talk to each other very well because their parallel memories of what happened are so personalized. And my question then is, how can we, is there a way to solve this in any short term, or do we just have to live with it? And I would like Dr. Snyder and Professor Brent to help us with this.
I think it's a real problem with no easy solution, and I think most of the attempts to find an easy solution only make the problem worse. Most of the attempts to find an easy solution involve saying that one memory is his history and the other one simply propaganda. That's the move which is generally made. My memory is really history, and I'm going to defend it as history. Your memory is propaganda, or your memory is a kind of mistake, and I'm going to call it as such. That's the easiest, apparently the easiest solution. It's a solution of tyrannical states, and it's also the solution that people try to apply sometimes in pluralist societies. I think we have to accept that memories are going to be different, that they're never going to be the same. I think it's a mistake to try to strive for some kind of unified memory on any scale. I think what we have to be able to do instead, at least as historians, is try to move beyond that framework. The first step, of course, is to see that both memories have some connection to historical reality, as they usually do. I mean, not always, but they usually do. The next step is to notice that there are things that have historical reality which have no memories, right? So who remembers the Soviet prisoners of war who died in Lithuania? Almost as many Soviet prisoners of war were starved to death in this country as Jews were shot. Who remembers them? They don't have a memory, and yet they have a history. They were people just as real as you and as me. So you start by saying, okay, the memory must reflect some history, and then you ask, who here is not being remembered? And in every country, there's going to be a different answer to that question. And then you ask for larger frameworks, as was already being suggested. So when we say us, when we say me, when we say our memory, we almost always mean the national society, and terribly often that means an ethno-national society as well. One way to move the level up has already been suggested, which is to think in terms of the state. Who are the citizens of Lithuania or Estonia, in your question? Who are the citizens? Are we treating them as citizens? Does our history, even if it's a national history, include the citizens of the country? Because, of course, the Holocaust in Lithuania is largely a matter, to some very significant degree, a matter of some Lithuanian citizens killing other Lithuanian citizens. And if we think of all the people involved as citizens, that's one way of getting them all into the picture, right? The same can be said of virtually any other crime, right? The hunger, the starvation in Ukraine was a Soviet policy. In practice, it involved a lot of Ukrainians starving a lot of other Ukrainians, a lot of Soviet citizens killing a lot of other Soviet citizens. So if we can think upward to the level of a state, we've made a start. The framework that I proposed in my book was that of human beings, that we accept that states matter, we accept that nations matter, we accept that political and national allegiances count in the world, that they're real things, but that if we want to understand the event, we have to go up to the highest level of starting with human beings and ending with human beings. I think this is one way of affirming what I take to be a basic truth, which is that historians cannot try to be memory managers. We can be aware of what the memory problems are, but if we try to solve them too directly, we just make them worse, and I'm afraid that's what we very often do. I think historians are responsible or co-responsible for a lot of these problems. We have to take a step back and say, okay, the memories are a fact in the world. The memories constrain how we communicate with people. Maybe they even determine where we start. But as historians, we have to be doing something else besides just contributing to one memory or another. We have to be trying to pursue a discipline which is both a kind of science, but also a kind of humanity. And if we manage to do that, then maybe in the end, people with their various memories will find ways to talk to each other that they didn't have before. I think that's the most we can possibly hope for, which is another way of saying, I don't think there are easy solutions. I think there are hard solutions, which may with time do a little tiny bit.
I don't have very much to add to what Professor Snyder just said. I completely agree with him. I think the case of Jewish memory, however, is in some ways a special case, because the Jewish memory of persecution is 2,000 years old. It seemed and seems to many today that the Holocaust was merely the culmination of 2,000 years of exclusion, 2,000 years of oppression, 2,000 years of marginalization. As one historian said, it began with, "We don't want to live with you," and it ended with, "We don't want you to live at all." And the Jewish people, one can speak of them as a nation, perhaps, not to mention Israel, but the Jewish people was dispersed among many nations. And so its national memory is intimately and very tragically, I would say, fused with the nations that rejected them. Polish Jews regard themselves as Polish Jews. Lithuanian Jews regard themselves as Lithuanian Jews. In my family, we were Russian Jews. Why were we all living in America? Because the Russians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Ukrainians, and the Germans didn't want us. And so the stigma of rejection is very, very deep in what many writers have called the historical consciousness of the Jewish people. It is not something to be overcome lightly. The answers are going to be difficult ones. Part of it has to do with an education that goes beyond an education of the years 1939 to 1945. It has to do with the fact that perhaps those 2,000 years of exile were not all just 2,000 years of pogroms, 2,000 years of rapes, 2,000 years of beatings and humiliation, but that there was more in those 2,000 years that's actually interesting to discover, such as why my grandfather had blue eyes. Why, when my grandmother was 98 years old and her mind was wandering and she knew only one language, which was Yiddish, which was why I could never communicate with her effectively. But why was it she began to speak Ukrainian and spoke of her neighbor who had a cow? What was it about that memory, when you speak of memory and narratives, that was significant in her life? It was that she also had another home, not in America, but it was in her heart, and that home was in Ukraine. And that is the case with many of the Litvaks abroad. Their home is here in Vilnius, and yet they can't touch it. They can't feel it. They can't reclaim it. And so what we're dealing with from the Jewish point of view requires not just brain surgery, soul surgery. It requires the utmost finesse. It requires the utmost sensitivity. It's not something to lecture people about. It requires contact. It requires people to come together and to talk. It requires many different ways of finding these routes of communication. I think that narratives such as Bloodlands is an opening for that. It is not the conclusion of it by any means. There are multiplicities of narratives that are published in small editions that no one reads about survival during the Holocaust. There is not a single person, I would venture to say, and I could well be wrong, who survived on his own. It's very rare, if at all. The personal narratives that I know of always speak of a Ukrainian or a Lithuanian or a Pole, or more than one. As Yehuda Bauer wrote, it took one bullet to kill one man, but it generally took 50 people to save one. Those are the stories that need to be told. Those are the narratives that are as important, morally as important, as the death camps and the killings in Ponari. And it's very difficult to tell those stories in the climate of the sorrow and the grief that all of the peoples of this region have experienced. And it may be that it's the work of another generation, in a sense. And if I speak longer, I'll only be repeating myself.
Thank you, Jonathan. And of course, we are sitting at the Tolerance Center, remarks quite apropos, and a building which housed at one time, when we must remember, an extremely vibrant and beautiful cultural life. The question is by Juras and Shilote. The presence of the Soviet Union severely restricted historical analysis on both sides of the Iron Curtain for decades. Since its collapse, how has this impacted Western historical understanding of these issues as well as more local historiographies? That's a two-part question. So if you would agree, Dr. Snyder, you could answer the one on the West, and I could ask one of my colleagues here to talk about local historiography.
So I've spent a lot of time talking about how historians in their magnificent patience and wisdom can help everyone else. So I'm now going to say a critical word about historians. The end of the Cold War has had less effect on Western historiography than one would have liked, and the change has been much slower than one would have expected. And I should have said this in response to your original question. One of the things which made my book possible, thinkable, was the end of the Cold War. Because with the end of the Cold War, one can not only use East European Soviet archival collections about Soviet crimes, one can also learn much more about German crimes. Because every single major German crime, with the exception of the euthanasia program, every single major German crime took place in that part of the world which was then called Eastern Europe. The German mass murders happened, and then the Iron Curtain fell. And so the end of the Cold War was not just an opportunity for us to think again about Soviet communism, it was also an opportunity for us to return to the study of the Holocaust and to return to the history of German crimes. Now, many researchers have done this, but startlingly few, let's say, specialists on the Holocaust have learned Yiddish or Polish or Russian or the languages they would need to exploit these resources. I would say it's almost a shocking fact how few Western specialists on the Holocaust have learned one of the languages which would allow them to work in Eastern Europe. There have been a few Germans, there have been a few Americans, but really startlingly few. And so to a great extent, we have been very slow to appreciate how much it matters that we have access to all of these materials. But insofar as it has mattered, it's mattered in the ways that I tried to describe. Is there any chance that you two will stop talking at any point? Okay. Insofar as it has mattered, the ways that it has mattered have been the ways that I've tried to describe. Namely, it's allowed history to go beyond national boundaries. It's allowed history to penetrate into individual experience, and the individual experience then allows us to draw larger conclusions. So just to name one collection which is very important. In 1944, 45, 46, the Central Committee of Polish Jews collected a series of responses from all of the Jewish survivors returning from the Soviet Union. These were all, in one way or another, Holocaust survivors, and they were asked a standard list of questions so that you can very easily compare their responses and learn. This is probably the single most important body of first-person evidence in the history of the Holocaust. But because it was in Warsaw, very few people used it. Once you can use it, then you not only see the Holocaust much more clearly as an East European experience, but you're forced into the position of doing this transnational or trans-imperial history. Because, of course, the way that many of these people survived was that they were deported to Kazakhstan. And their deportation to Kazakhstan in 1940, like many Lithuanian Jews were as well, by the way, their deportation to Kazakhstan forces Soviet power into the account. So the end of the Cold War was crucially important for the work that I was trying to do. But in a way, I was trying to push things forward out of my own sense of disappointment that somebody else hadn't written this book already.
Could I ask Sarunas or Egidijus to comment on local historiography? You should decide among yourselves who's going to speak.
Yeah, we're in the center of tolerance. I want to repeat, yeah. So we're tolerant, yeah, to each other. I think the greatest advantage of the collapse of the Soviet Union generally, that all the national historiographies, and Lithuanian historiography is not an exception, was basically exposed to the Western narratives and to the Western research, and there were many examples of interesting and fruitful cooperation between the historians on both sides, and many projects written, many archival files researched, and this cooperation was very extensive, and it continues to be so. However, the problem is, as few others mentioned here, and especially Timothy, when he spoke about linguistic abilities on both sides, very often the problem is on the Lithuanian side that very few people are also still fluent in Western languages and they can present themselves abroad, and on another side we have still very little competence to read of what is written here. And so historiography is very often, and Lithuanian historiography is not an exception, it functions for itself. Everybody is nice to each other, and sometimes not very nice, but still the historians function in a kind of secluded milieu. And this exposure to the other narratives, to the other cultures, to the other languages is a slow process. It's continuing, and the situation with different neighbors and with different countries and different languages is very diverse. And I think the situation is much better with the Polish. But when we speak about, for example, French historiography and Lithuanian participation somehow in the process of French written historical narratives and literature, naturally, probably Lithuania is nearly absent over there. And I could continue on many different examples, and I think Egidijus wants to say something additional.
Yeah, I want to repeat myself. I would say that 20 years passed, and Lithuanian historiography really came through some boom. Have in mind not very big number of the professional researchers, and then check the bibliography, how much it was fulfilled. And 20 years and publications, even of the most painful and most dirty questions of Lithuanian history, are quite serious. In my understanding, it was so big work done here. But why I told, I'm gonna repeat myself. In my understanding, Lithuanian historians, maybe all workshop of our brothers historians, they are emphasizing research itself, knowledge itself, but not the storytelling. It's a bit of different thing. It's sometimes difficult even to say for young students that history craft or history art is really more complex than you think. One is to have your sources, to understand something, to research, to collect that sort of knowledge. Another one, imagine the address, whom you will tell your story, what is this form or stage of consciousness, and then tell that. And until now, we are not enough skillful in that. We still are knowing a lot, learning a lot, collecting a lot, but not so nice storytellers.
Yes, I think from looking at some of the Western recent histories, particularly, for example, Karen Sutton's book, you would never know that there was a very rich Lithuanian language historiography of the last 15 years dealing with all the topics she covers. It's a sad state of affairs.
May I make one comment?
Yeah.
It'll be very brief, but you provoked my memory on this point. In my work in the Soviet archives got to a point where I thought we had collected a sufficient amount of documentation to produce a textbook. And I went to Alexander Yakovlev, and I said to him, why don't you become the main author of a textbook that will be used in courses? Now, this is in light of the fact that Putin actually has produced such a textbook now, because he has a national narrative that he wishes to provoke. And what Yakovlev said to me, and why we never did it, was, we are not ready to write that story. And he said, I will not attempt to do so. And for, I'm sure, many of the same kinds of reasons.
But you remember me also another fact, because Lithuania felt a lot of different blames from Russian side. I mean, official documents about the human rights or something like that. And I remember from the last spring this report blaming Lithuania, that Lithuanians translated so fast Timothy Snyder's book Bloodlands.
That was a complaint, yes.
That is some sort of proof of that state of consciousness.
We can all apologize to Moscow for that one, yeah. How about another question, Nick? No, is that it? Okay. It looks like we are running out of time in our program, and I once again would like to thank all of you who have attended in this wonderful institution, and all our panelists, Drs. Aleksandravicius and Liekis, as well as our American guests, Dr. Snyder and Dr. Brent. Thank you again, and have a good day in Vilnius.